Divisive behavior. Though it's natural to prefer certain spiritual leaders, we should not allow these preferences to create divisions in the church. Here's Gene.
So very quickly, Paul gets into this, and this is what he says. For it has been reported to me about you, my brothers, sisters, that's generic, by members of Chloe's household, a very reliable source, that there are quarrels among you. By the way, I'm sure Chloe, or whoever in his household communicated with Paul, didn't say, now, Paul, I want you to know what's going on here in Corinth, but don't use my name. He didn't say that, or Paul wouldn't have probably used his name, or he would have said, Chloe, I need to use your name. In other words, we can't resolve this problem unless we're wide open, we're honest in terms of what's going on here. So if this is a real issue and you believe it is, then you should be able to put your name behind it, which Chloe obviously was, and whoever in his household was willing to do that because his motives were right, his heart was right, and it was a real issue. And so Paul could deal with it. And so he says, it's reported there are quarrels among you, and what I am saying is this. Each of you says, I'm with Paul, or I'm with Apollos, or I'm with Cephas, or I'm with Christ. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Paul founded the church. He was a great apostle of the Gentiles. That made him a very significant person in the founding of that church. Later on, Apollos, who, after he got straightened out theologically by Aquila and Priscilla, wanted to go to Achaia and went to Corinth and followed up on Paul's ministry. And Apollos was a great orator and evangelist and a really powerful communicator. Personally, I believe he probably wrote the book of Hebrews. Can't prove that. But he was a very strong leader. And so there were some in Corinth who were saying, Paul, who in the world is he? Well, he's the founder of your church. And some of them believed that, knew that, and remembered it, and they got an argument with the Apollosites over who was the greatest. And then some said, I'm with Cephas. That's Peter. Now, how Peter got into the mix, we're not quite sure, but it's possible that some of these people were Jews who went to Jerusalem when the Holy Spirit came and the church was born. Remember, they came from all over the New Testament world. And when Paul went to Corinth, he went first into the synagogue and began to minister to the Jews. And it's possible that some of those Jews who heard Peter several years before, once again heard it from Paul and then became believers, but after they heard it, they said, we first heard it from Peter. So we're influenced by Peter, and he was the apostle of the Jews. Paul was the apostle of the Gentiles, so we're of Peter. And then some pulled their righteous robes around them, and they said, we're of Jesus. Now, who can argue with that? Except their motives were wrong. They were saying, I'm following Christ, and it was an arrogant statement. It was just as divisive as the other statements. So you can even, have partial truth and still create all kinds of problems. And I think that's what was happening here in Corinth, this divisive behavior. So the issue probably wasn't doctrine that they were arguing over. Because these three guys, Paul, Apollos, Peter, were on the same page theologically. It had to do with just following man, following personalities. And we're going to see a little later what the real reason was for this issue. And even those who said we're following Christ had things distorted. I thought about Peter's words himself in his first epistle. In 1 Peter 5, 1-4, he says, therefore, as a fellow elder, witness to the sufferings of the Messiah, also a participant in the glory about to be revealed. He's referring there, of course, to being on the Mount of Transfiguration and seeing Jesus transfigured, which was an illustration, a exposure of what it would be like when Jesus Christ comes back again in his glorified body. So he said, I was a participant in the glory about to be revealed. I exhort the elders among you. Here are the spiritual leaders in the church. Shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but freely, according to God's will, not for the money, eagerly, but not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Now, here's the distortion that I think Peter exposes in the thinking of those who say we follow Christ. Peter said, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. It's possible to be a follower of Jesus, which should be our primary concern, but also to give honor and respect to the under-shepherds that are leading the church. And they had the thing totally out of kilter. Some were following men. Others were saying we're following Christ, ignoring men, and getting this whole thing in a perspective that totally was out of the will of God. So Paul is trying to deal with this issue of divisive behavior. And the question for you is, how do some Christians today engage in the same sinful attitudes and actions as the Corinthians? Well, first of all, and we're going to talk about this a little later, we all have our preferences. That's not wrong. But when our preferences become divisive, then we've got to be very, very careful, because we're walking out of the will of God. The motivation for this behavior in Corinth was carnal, it was selfish, and a focus on their own personal concerns, not what was right and proper for the whole church. Now, Paul's going to come back to this. And when he does, he's going to give us more insight as to how these people were behaving, what really motivated them, what was really driving them. And it's very fascinating because Paul does unfold that just a little bit later.